God calls individuals to partner with him is the title of this particular segment. And I want to review something first as we begin. And the reason I'm reviewing it is because it's very hard for people in the 21st century here in North America to understand that there is enormous difference between contract and covenant, because this is confused by most of the churches in North America and probably in Western Europe as well. You know, contract is all about contract law and what we're familiar with on an everyday basis here in North America. Contract law is all about stuff and money. Judeo wrote a few years ago, actually back in 1974, he was talking about this whole concept of contract versus covenant. And he said, you know, a contract is an agreement made in suspicion. The parties do not trust each other, and they set limits to their responsibility. On the other hand, a covenant is an agreement made in trust. The parties love each other and put no limits on their own responsibility. You see, there's a tremendous difference in attitude between contract and covenant. Again, I'll read that again. A contract is an agreement made in suspicion. The parties do not trust each other, and they set limits on their own responsibility. A covenant is an agreement made in trust. The parties love each other and put no limits on their own responsibility. And Wicasa, the author of those statements, he illustrated it this way, and it's a fundamental difference, and it's created problems before. This misunderstanding, perhaps it's willful, perhaps it was indeliberate, not deliberate. But anyways, you know, when the Indians back in the 1800s, and he says this, and the Indian leaders made treaties with the Great White Father, and they called them covenants, sealing them with the smoke of the sacred pipe. The trouble between the white man and Indian began when the Great White Father, his lieutenants and merchants looked at the treaties and began calling them contracts. And thus began, according to Mr. Wicasa, from a basic religious difference, this began a conflict in cultures. And much of what happened about or 1800s, maybe even going to the 1900s, is a conflict in cultures. Now, the question I want to ask, is this difficulty of understanding the difference of the difference between contract and covenant, is that a basic reason why we have so much confusion in our Western world among the various Christian churches and understanding what the Bible is really saying, both to the individual as well as to the nation? Because there is a tremendous amount of confusion, even in the Church of God. This concept of covenant as opposed to contract, it's just not understood very well. Now, Bruce Shelley in Bible.org on the net, he has also a little article. He talks about contract versus covenant. He says this way. He puts it this way. In modern times, we defined a host of relations by contracts. These are usually for goods and services and for hard cash. Yeah, most of us know that. If you buy a car, you buy anything, you're signing a contract, and it's specifying, it's got all this fine print, right? You use a credit card, whatever it may be, you have a contract with the credit card company. You have a contract with most things that you're exchanging goods and services for in these days and this time. The contract, whether formal or informal, helps to specify, Mr. Shelley puts it, specify failure in these relationships. It's focused on much, again, it's the whole point of suspicion and how to limit your responsibility. Contracts are broken when one of the party fails to keep his promise. And then he gives an example. He said, think about it. With a patient, if a patient, in the medical system, if a patient fails to keep an appointment with the doctor's not obligated to call the house and ask, "Where are you? Why aren't you here? Why didn't you show up?" No, the doctor simply goes on to his next appointment. Maybe he makes a note to his secretary, and so make sure that, especially these days, that if you're a no-show, you've got to pay your $20, $30, $40, $50, whatever it might be for the no-show. The point is that maybe the patient is charged for a misappointment, for breaking this informal contract, but the doctor and the patient. But the doctor really is under no obligation to really care for the patient, to look at the what's happened, why isn't he here? He's not looking forward to it. Shelley points out that the Bible, however, indicates that God's everlasting covenant that he talks about in the Bible, in this book, is more like something that dealing with family ties, something like a parent with a child, rather than this idea of a doctor to his patient, or a merchant or a business person with his client. Consider, if a child fails to show up for dinner, what's the parent's obligation? Well, what, do you not worry about it? The parent doesn't, I'm going to fine them, for something for not showing up. I'm going to punish them for something like this. Now, usually the parent is going to be very concerned, why didn't this child show up? Yeah, they may punish them for whatever, depending upon the reason, but there's usually no set, specific thing. It's a relationship that the parent has with the child. Shelley points out that human failures cannot invalidate or annul a divinely initiated relationship. If a child doesn't show up for dinner, when they're supposed to, this doesn't invalidate the relationship between parent and child. I mean, that would be ridiculous. All right, you didn't show up for dinner, or you didn't wash the dishes, therefore you are no longer my child. Move out of here, I mean, is that the way it works? You treat your children that way? Did your parents treat you that way? Did you ever see something like that? No, usually what happens is if you don't do according to what the parent wants you to do, there might be consequences. Maybe in the old days you'd get your hide tanned. That might have been what would happen, or maybe you'd have to do, you were grounded, or you'd do dishes for whatever it might have been. But just because somebody failed to fulfill their responsibility didn't mean that there was no longer a bond. Dad was no longer dad, and son was no longer son, or mom was no longer mom, and daughter was no longer. That's not the way it works, is it? Covenant is very much like that. And one of the things that perhaps is the closest here in the modern times of us trying to understand a little bit of this difference between covenant and contract is the whole idea of marriage. In most marriage vows, what do you specify? You specify that you love and respect each other in good times and in bad times, in sickness and in health, in riches and in poverty, until separated by death. That's the way it used to always be. When I was a young person, just starting to become a teenager, my parents were divorced. At that point in time, that was really, really unusual. There was nobody, I think in my 7th grade class, whose parents were divorced, except for my parents. Out of a whole classroom of some 30-odd children, my parents were the only ones, and my family was the only one that was breaking up due to divorce. I dare say you go to most public school classrooms these days, and you are going to find just the opposite. It may be out of a classroom of 30 people, you're only going to have 1 or 2 where the original 2 parents are still there. It's completely reversed the opposite way. You realize how far we've come in my lifetime? How far we've changed, and much of this is because we don't understand the nature of covenant. When you got married, a husband didn't say he'd only love his wife as long as she was slim, pretty, charming, cooked good meals, responded to his needs wholeheartedly, and laughed at all his jokes and respected him. Okay, was that part of the service? And the wife, the bride, she agreed to be married only so long as he earned well, had an athletic build, did not lose his hair, treated her courteously, and was always kind and considerate, loving, and gentle. No, come on, give me a break. that's not the way real life is and hasn't been for thousands of years between men and women. It's just not the way it works, is it? No, it's not. Marriage is not that way. Now, we have some wealthy people these days who make what they call prenuptial contracts. They're making these things for possession because they want to hold on to all their stuff if their beloved turns out to be a bimbo. I mean, they don't trust them, beyond how, maybe as far as they can, not even as far as they can throw them. So they want to limit their liability. They want to limit the access of the other person to whatever. There is no unconditional opening up and to the other person from this standpoint. But truly a marriage covenant is unconditional. It's a giving of oneself of love. It's the unconditional acceptance of the other person. A marriage covenant endures. It creates family bonds, not just limited legal obligations. You're creating something that's going to last, and you create something that will have an effect that will transcend the generations. You know, my parents have been divorced now. What was I saying there the other day? It's getting to be over 50, getting close to be 50 years. It's just a little less. It's 47 or so years my parents had been divorced. But you know, even to this day, they can't help but occasionally think of each other. And of course, there's myself and my brother and our kids. Yeah, it goes on. It's this type of thing. It's the obligations will continue to go on, even if the formal legal links are broken. The covenant, the fact that they got together and married and had children, you know, there's still something that remains of it, even to this day. And you know, in Canada, if one of the partners to a marriage, even after they've been divorced, they fall on hard times, they can go to the courts and say, hey, you know, I need some help. And the courts will say, look at the husband. If he's doing well, they'll say, you've got to pay her. He said, but I've been divorced and whatever. You know, the courts can still go in there and said, well, too bad, you know, she needs help. And they've actually done this here in Canada. A marriage covenant creates enduring family bonds. It's not just limited legal obligations. The everlasting covenant that God makes with us and those he chooses to reveal his true nature, he does so. He uses descriptive language of family and kinship, because what God is building with us, the relationship God has with us, is a covenant relationship. It's not a contract. You know, we've got to look for this, you know, the small print. We find out which, you know, where the hook is. Now, God is making with us something quite different. God's everlasting covenant is an ongoing, continuing relationship between the parties who are living together in the covenant. It implies growth. It implies progress. It's not static. Rather, it's constantly developing. See, you can't list all the things that are going to be in a marriage of what's going to happen in the future. We're not even close. It doesn't work that way. It's not a contract. It's a covenant. It implies growth. It implies movement. It implies progress. It's not static. It's adaptable, extremely adaptable. You know, God wants your life. His covenant isn't about your money and your stuff. He's not sitting there trying to micromanage every little detail, you know, say this is, you know, you've got to fulfill this, do all. That's not how it is. God is interested in you. He's interested in your life. He didn't sign a contract with you, you know, that you're going to give him so much money and he's going to do this and this. That's not the deal. Spiritually speaking, living in the covenant eventually does lead to what? It leads to salvation. When God calls someone to his covenant, it's for a reason. That God doesn't do things just, you know, for no, you know, just because. He does things for a reason. There's a job to be done. He calls individual because he has a master plan. And he's calling you, he's calling me to become part of his narrative, part of the divine narrative, part of the story. Not just outsiders reading the story. We're not outsiders reading the story. This is our book. It's our story. That's what a covenant is all about. You become part of the story. You're not an outsider anymore. Now, what are the personal qualities that God looks for in people that he calls? Let's take a look here. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 2. I want you to turn with me in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 66 and verse 2. And I'm going to read this in the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Isaiah 66 and verse 2. The Holman Christian Standard Bible says this, starting in verse 2. My hand made all these things, and so they all came into being. This is the Lord's declaration. I will look favorably on this kind of person, one who is humble, submissive. And here the Hebrew word literally means one who's broken. That means figuratively repentant. Submissive in spirit and who trembles at my word. This is the person that God is looking for. This is why, God, you won't find, and you read through here, God doesn't have a lot good to say about those who are proud and arrogant and haughty. I'm going to do it my way. God, those aren't going to be the people who are part of the story from the standpoint of being insiders of the story. Let's go to 1 Peter 3 and chapter 3 in the New Covenant Scriptures, in the Greek Scriptures. 1 Peter 3 and in verse 3. And I'll read this in the English Standard Version. Apostle Peter said this, talking about the kind of people that God is looking to. That God is looking to live with him in his covenant. Because, when God has to look at it, he's looking for a long, long ways into the future. He's looking all the way down into the vanishing point for that everlasting covenant. 1 Peter 3 and verse 3, do not let your adorning, and he's speaking to women here, but it could be applied just as well these days to men, adorning be external, the braiding of hair, and putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. But yet your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husband. That's not the spirit of our times, is it? You hear, is that what's being really taught in the women's magazines, on many of the shows, and in classes and universities? And it's not. If you're true to what you're hearing, it's just the opposite oftentimes of what's being taught. The people that God is going to look to live in covenant, they must be inwardly motivated to love and serve God. Let's go to Romans chapter 2 and verse 29. Let's go to Romans 2 and verse 29. This inward motivation is something that's extremely important to God. It always has been. It's what you are. It's what you are inside. This is what God is looking at. It's what you are inside. It's not this. It's not the form, the face that you can show to the world. Yeah, I'm a good person, so I'm going to show I'm a good person. And you can put on this act. That's not what God looks for. He's looking far deeper than that. You go to Romans 2 and verse 29. The Apostle Paul put it this way. He said, but a Jew being a person who is, viscerally in the covenant, somebody who has this background of a people who are supposed to be living with God and have a knowledge of God. But a Jew is one inwardly, he says. The real Jew is one who is inwardly, okay? It's not a matter of the fact that you have a kippah or a yarmulke on your head. It's not the fact that you have fringes that you're wearing. It's, that's not the sort of thing that, or the side curls if you're really ultra-Orthodox, to show that you're faithful in these things. That's not what he's looking for. He says a real Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit and not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Far too often in what we do, people are religious. They like to look religious. In many of our major Christian churches these days, you'll find the people who are the clergy, they like to look religious. They dress up. It's like dress up day. Okay, we're going to dress up now, and I'm going to wear, whatever it is, depending upon the church, they do it a little bit differently. Somewhere we'll go the black, some like red or the purple or the white or however they might do, and they'll wear a very specific religious garment, or they'll do the collar if it's a little more conservative, maybe with a, just to make themselves stand out. They like to look religious. They like to have this praise of man, but God is saying now he's looking for something that is on the inside. It's been something he's been thinking about, not just from the time when Paul wrote Romans, but much, much earlier. Let's go to Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy. This might surprise a lot of people. So a lot of people would say, well, Moses and they were just all about the letter of the law. You just did this and this and this. That's all you were expected to do. But the one that the people of Israel were trying to live in a covenant with was God. And God hasn't changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 16 in the English Standard Version. I'll read this one, the ESV. God inspired Moses to write this. He said, "Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn." Yeah, they knew all about how to circumcise the flesh, but that wasn't really what counted. Yeah, you should do that. They were going to, you had to do that to be part of the nation, be part of the tribe. But what God was saying, circumcise, it was just a symbol to your foreskin of your heart. The thing is, I want you to have this heart of being gentle, being teachable, being kind, being loving, being faithful. He repeats this point even. Let's go to a little towards the end of that particular book to Deuteronomy 30. Again, staying in the English Standard Version. Deuteronomy 30, some 20 chapters later, towards the end of the book. Verse 6. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. "And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart." Now, this is a prophecy that Moses was giving. "The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live." Yes, to live is going to have to be something that, is going to require this conversion process, that the heart had to be circumcised. That was what was going to be really needed to live in an unending covenant with God. That was what was going to be needed. Let's go to Jeremiah 32. Jeremiah 32 and verse 39. Another prophecy. This was shortly after some of the things that were written prophesying of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31. And just a few verses later in Jeremiah 32, God has this. He inspired prophet Jeremiah to write this. Jeremiah 32 and verse 39, again, the ESV. "I will give them," talking of the children of Israel and the children of Judah, both he's talking of. He's making a distinction between the two. "I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever for their own good and for the good of their children after them." Yeah, it's going to be for their good and for the children after them, because when the parents depart from living the way of God, the children are going to suffer. You see this in the schools all the time. You can know exactly, oftentimes, or at least 9 times out of 10, what's going on with the parent just by looking at the child. Verse 40, I will make with them, he says, I will make with them an everlasting covenant, that I will not turn away from doing good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. God is saying he's going to give them this one heart, and he's going to give them this one way, that they will respect God and respect him forever for their good and for their children, because then he's not going to turn away from them. He will be able to make that everlasting covenant with them. God was going to have to do that for them. He knew it was not possible for them on their own. He had enough experiences over the years to know that. And again, in Ezekiel, a different prophet, again the same thing. God, in Ezekiel 36 and verse 26, that's Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 26, God again prophesied. He was saying this through the prophet Ezekiel, and I will put within you, that is, within you, the children of Israel, very specifically, he's making the point here, a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Now, what was Jesus' point of view of all this? Who is the person? Who is the person God is going to select? What are the qualities that God is looking for among the people he wants to work with, the people he wants to choose to partner with him, to live in the covenant? Well, we already heard these prophecies all the way, whether we're talking about Paul or whether they're talking about Moses or we're talking about Jeremiah or we're talking about Ezekiel. We're looking for these things, something on the inward heart, inward person. This difference of how we live with God. Jesus had this to say, and of course Jesus would have, he was the God of the old covenant, if you want to put it that way. He was the one who appeared to Moses in the burning bush. He's the one that rescued Israel out of Egyptian bondage. He's the one who did this, so he knows pretty well what he's always wanted right from the get-go. This wasn't anything new to him, but Jesus put it this way. In Matthew chapter 3 and 5, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3. I'm going to read this in the Cassier translation, Cassier's New Covenant translation. That's Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3. He says this, and he puts it this way. A blessing rests on those whose spirit makes them think poorly, but poorly of themselves. The kingdom of heaven shall be theirs. Verse 4, a blessing rests on those whose lives are full of sorrow. They shall find themselves comforted. Verse 5, a blessing rests on those who are of a gentle spirit. They shall be the ones to possess the earth. Verse 6, a blessing rests on those who hunger and thirst that right might be done. They shall have their satisfaction. A blessing rests on those who are compassionate. They shall have compassion shown to them. A blessing rests on those whose hearts are full of innocence. They shall see God before their very eyes. A blessing rests on those who are bent on establishing peace. Sons of God is the name that shall be given them. A blessing rests on those who suffer persecution in defense of the right. The kingdom of heaven belongs to them. This is the type of things that God has always been looking for. Those who come to know about God and who choose to seek to him, who choose to respond to his calling, to his promptings that he gives, well, he has work for them to do. Because when we respond to God's call, we are in essence responding to an opportunity to join in partnership with God. Be part of this narrative, to be part of this story that has been going on for so many years now, thousands of years. We elect to we decide that we want to be part of the story. God has work for those who do seek him. Those he calls, who he sees has these qualities and these characteristics. He says, I want this one. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at several individuals here in the Bible quickly. And we'll take a look and see some of the characteristics of what God did in living in covenant, the kind of work that he had for different people, why he chose them. Because he doesn't choose us for no reason. He's always calling us for different reasons. Let's go to Genesis, the book of Genesis chapter 6, in the book of beginnings. Why did God choose Noah? Let's go to Genesis chapter 6, and let's go to verse 5. The world of that time, God looked over what was going on the earth at that particular time, and it starts here in verse 5. God wasn't very happy. He says, "And the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Boy, there are a lot of places that you can go, and if you pay attention to our media these days, you could say there's a lot of that still going on from this standpoint. Verse 6, "And the Lord repented that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the crawling thing, and the fowl of the air. For I repent that I've made them." God was really ticked off with what he saw. He was very, very disappointed. And it wasn't just with people. He was at that point where he said, I'm going to get rid of all of it. He wanted peace. He was so disappointed with what he saw. But then verse 8, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." On the face of the earth, there was one who attracted his attention. God said, there's something different about this one. He was a man who was righteous. He was a man who walked with God. Verse 9, "These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man and perfect in his generations, for Noah walked with God." He walked with him. He enjoyed God's values. He valued the same thing that God did. He appreciated the beauties and the things of what God had made. So they were able to walk together. Now, verse 11, "Now the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth." And we're doing that very quickly ourselves, both here in Canada and the United States in particular, but we're not the only places. There's plenty of this going on right and left, right before our eyes. "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Okay, so he's going to take action. But what is he doing? God has a plan. He has an idea. He's seen Noah, and he says, I have an idea. He says to him in verse 14, "Make an ark of cypress timbers. You shall make rooms in the ark, and you shall pitch it inside and outside with pitch. And this is the way you're going to make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits." Okay, that's about 450 feet. 450 feet. You think about this. You're sitting there. Okay, I've got a job for you. Hey, Noah, I've got a great idea. I want an ark. 300 cubits, 450 feet. The breadth of it shall be 50 cubits, 75 feet. And its height 30 cubits, 45 feet. And you shall make windows in the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and you shall set the door of the ark in the side of it, and you shall make it with the lower, second, and third stories. Wow. Okay, all right. And this is, you couldn't just call up Home Depot and say, would you please deliver, 2 train loads, 5 train loads full of lumber, and, a couple tons of nails and bolts. It didn't happen that way. Noah is thinking, I've got 3 sons. We're going to be busy for some time. But, it didn't freak Noah out. From whatever perspective, I see, you don't fear any argument with that. Noah wasn't arguing with God about this. He said he started doing it. And behold, because he understood what God was doing. Behold, I, even I, am bringing a flood of waters upon the earth to order it to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is upon the earth shall die. Now, this is the one who became Jesus Christ who said this. You need to think about that. Verse 18, but I will establish my covenant with you. This is what God said to Noah. I've seen you. I've seen that you're righteous in this your generation, that you value the things that I value. And you found grace and favor in my sight. And I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. And you shall bring into the ark 2 of every kind, of every living thing, of all flesh, to keep them alive with you, and they shall be male and female. 2 of every kind shall come to you to keep them alive, of fowls of their kind, and animals after their kind, and of every crawling thing of the earth after its kind. And take for yourself all that is eaten as food, and you shall gather it for yourself, and it shall be for food for you and for them. And verse 22 gives a response. And Noah did so, according to all that God commanded him. So he did. He didn't find it unusual. He didn't find it, he was being put upon because, he just signed up to partner with God to go into the zoo business and boat building business. He'd probably never built a boat before in his life. And he may not have even liked animals that much. Maybe he didn't even have one pet. No, he was going to have he's going to have thousands. But he was willing to do it. In verse 7, the point is that God is saying he's going to establish his covenant with him. That this is the type of person that God is choosing to keep with him. That is the type of person that he wanted to have something to do with. And this is just a fantastic thing. All right. We will find my right page here. So, Noah, in verse 7, God commands him here in verse 1. You see that he commands him, and the Lord said to Noah, you and all your house shall come into the ark. For you I have seen righteous before me in this generation. He says, he gives some additional information. I thought I would read this at this point in time. For you shall take with you every clean animal by sevens, the male and female, and take 2 of the animals that are not clean, the male and the female. I'm reading this, part of the reason is to understand. See, God hasn't changed. He's always been the same. It is, as I've said before, the one who is speaking to Noah here later became the one we call Jesus Christ. He's the one who later in Moses and in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus started talking about the different things of, for instance, what are clean and what are unclean. But this was nothing new. Very clearly, the Bible is showing that right from the beginning that God had a way, and he was making a distinction between the clean and the unclean, between that which should be eaten and that which was not appropriate to be eaten. Anyways, so he takes in the different type of animals, more if they were clean and fit to be eaten as food, and less if they were not. And then in verse 4 it says, for in 7 more days I will cause it to rain upon the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from off the face of the earth every living thing that I've made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Let's go to chapter 8. And we have the flood. God shut him in, and the flood killed and wiped out everything that was there. The plan that God had for Noah was to preserve life. In chapter 8 and verse 1 here of Genesis, and God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. Verse 14. And in the 2nd month, on this 27th day of the month, the land was fully dry. So a little over a year later, after Noah had originally entered into the ark, after all the time it took him, and it was not a short period of time for him to build that ark, he was finally coming out. And God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you, and bring with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, of fowl, of livestock, and of every crawling thing that crawls upon the earth, so that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth." And Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, and every animal, every fowl, and every crawling thing, all that crawls upon the earth after their families, went forth out of the ark. And Noah built an altar to the Lord, and he took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, "I will not again curse the ground for man's sake. Although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will not again smite all living thing, as I have done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." God was pleased with his partner. He was pleased. It said, there's no thing that God commanded him to build an altar. No, this is something that Noah wanted to worship him. Noah wanted to worship the Lord because he understood what an incredible thing that he had done and that he had achieved through him. If we go down here to chapter 9, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the air, upon all that moves on the earth and upon all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you," according, of course, to the word of God. "Even as a green herb I have given you all things, but you shall not eat of flesh with the life in it, which is the blood." They weren't to eat anything with the blood. It's interesting. Here it is. We're in Genesis 9. Later on, when they were having the conference there in Jerusalem in Acts 15, this was one of the things that the church, all the apostles got together when they were bringing the Gentiles into the commonwealth of Israel. This is one thing they were going to insist that they also continue to follow and to respect. "You shall not eat of flesh with the life in it, which is the blood." Then verse 5, "And surely the blood of your lives will I require at the hand of any animal, will I require at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man." This is capital punishment for murder, prefiguring by a long, long time Exodus 20 and the 10 Commandments. The commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," you shall not murder, has been around for a very long time. From the time when Cain slew Abel, there was consequences. And at this point in time, God was going to say that if someone was a murderer, they should be killed. But we don't do that anymore because we're more civilized. No, we throw our murderers and rapists and these sorts of people in jail for a few years and let them out and let them do it one more time. And then we throw them in again and then let them out in a few more years and they do it one more time. And we seem to think we're smarter than God. Well, we pay the price for that. So anyways, we have here, then let's go down to verse 9. God says this, "Behold, I, even I, establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you." So God was making a covenant. He's making a relationship, an ongoing relationship, a relationship that's going to develop, that's going to expand, that's going to live and breathe because it's living. "With you and with every creature that is with you, the birds, of the livestock, of every animal on the earth with you, from all that go out from the ark, to every animal of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there be any more a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you, and every living creature with you for everlasting generations." The generations that go on from that point in time, we're saying to the vanishing point. into the horizon of the future. Verse 13, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It was a sign of this continuing love that God was going to have for all his creation, that he wasn't just going to destroy it this way, as long as there's going to be an earth, a physical earth. And it shall be that I will bring a cloud over the earth, and the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy the flesh. And the rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the token of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. It's a remarkable thing, God using the rainbow. I think it's highly ironic that there is a social movement that's been around here for a generation or so that uses the rainbow as their symbol to proclaim a way of life that God wouldn't accept. It's kind of sad from that standpoint. It is a symbol, however, of this covenant that God made between all flesh, everything that's living, that God wasn't just going to destroy it again because he'd get so upset at the wickedness and the evil that seems to come so naturally to humankind. We also have, and let's go a little bit farther, let's turn to Genesis 37. There were others that God called to partner with him who had specific jobs. The job of Noah was to save life at a time when humanity had totally corrupted itself to the point when God looked out, there was only one, and yet there was one was enough, that he would save all life because of the one. And so he had a job to do, and he did it and preserved it. That's why we're here. The story of fulfilling this there's similar themes. If we go to Genesis 37, we have the story of Joseph. And Joseph, in verse 1, and Jacob lived in the land of the sojournings of his father in the land of Canaan. This is the account of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, came tending the flock with his brothers. And he was a youth of the sons, and he was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought to his father an evil report of them. So you see here, God is saying a little something. Joseph was a bit of a goody two-shoes. He was ratting out his brothers and the things that they were doing. I don't know, maybe they were stopping in the local taverns after they'd spent the hard day with the sheep, and drinking too much and carrying on and stuff like this. Whatever they were doing, and it was probably all that and more. Joseph was telling Dad about it. And anyways, it says in verse 3, and Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a tunic reaching down to the soles of feet. This is a famous coat of many colors. In many essence, Joseph was being groomed at this point in time to be the family leader, to take over. I mean, he was one of the youngest, and he was going to take over. You could imagine how this was not very exciting to his brothers. Anyways, Jacob favors Joseph, and you see he makes him the coat of many colors. And you see immediately afterwards in verse 5 that Joseph dreamed a dream and told it to his brothers. And they hated him still more because Joseph had this dream that his brothers were going to bow down to him, that even his father and his mother were going to bow down to him, that they were going to do this sort of thing. And Joseph, for whatever particular reason, decided that he mentioned this. He said this to his brothers. And of course, all they did was they resented him more. They became more jealous and more resentful of this. And you see this whole thing that eventually, because of this, his brothers would sell him into slavery. They had thought of killing him perhaps at one point in time, but no. A couple of his brothers, Judah, said, why should we have his blood on his hands? Let's sell him out. And they did that. And he was sold to, God arranged for this fellow. He was sold to Potiphar. Now, this wasn't just, Potiphar was one of the Egyptians. He was taken down and sold. But obviously he was sold to somebody of importance because Potiphar was in the Egyptian administration. He was one of the people who served Pharaoh. In some versions will say he was the head of the executioners or he was head of the guards. He had this role of being sort of Pharaoh's enforcer. And he kind of, would take care of the people who were out of Pharaoh's favor. But anyways, you see the whole story of Joseph. We know how he was given to Potiphar. He became what? He was blessed in Potiphar's house. And everything that was under his hand, God caused to bless. And Joseph was a good-looking guy, and you know the story. Potiphar's wife decided, hey, this is a hunk. And he was Elvis Presley of his time, and she wanted him in her bed. But Joseph wouldn't do it because he understood. You see there very clearly that Joseph understood that it was something that he should not do. If we look here in Genesis 39, verse 39, and we go to verse 7. And after the things that came to pass, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused, and said to his master's wife, behold, my master does not know what's in the house with me, and he has given all that he has into my hand, and there is none greater in his house than I. Neither has he kept back anything from me except you, because you were his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? As well as Potiphar. Now, Joseph was the type of person that God had picked for a reason. And even when she framed him, Potiphar's wife, cooked up this story, and decided to teach Joseph a lesson, and Potiphar could have killed him right then and there when his wife lodged the story, but I guess Potiphar sort of knew his wife. And instead of him being a household servant, he decided to take him he made him work in his prison. Because Potiphar was head of the executioners, and you see when you read through Genesis very clearly that Potiphar was running this prison as well. He just put him in the prison, and the guy who was over the prison did the same thing Potiphar did at home. And God blessed everything that was in his hands. But God was with him. But God had a purpose. He was in partnership with God, and God had sent him down there originally for a purpose. He'd used dreams to really alienate his brother. Now he's going to use dreams one more time to do something else for him. Let's go to Genesis chapter 40. So Joseph was in jail. And the keeper of the prison didn't concern himself with anything that was Joseph, but he put everything under his responsibility because Joseph did it well. And he didn't have to worry about it. He could just sit there and take it easy and play cards or do whatever he was doing in those days. In chapter 40, it says this, now after these things it came to pass that the cupbearer, the king of Egypt, and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry against his two officials, and against the chief of the cupbearers, and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them under guard in the house of the chief of the executioners, into prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the chief of the executioners put Joseph in charge of them, and he served them, because these were important prisoners. Cupbearer of the king was a very important, and somebody who provided food to the king. They were very important because in the ancient world, people got rid of their competitors or somebody who was a political rival by poisoning them. And of course, the cupbearer was the one who had to make sure the wine wasn't poisoned, and the baker had to make sure the daily bread, the staff of life, wasn't poisoned either. So anyways, and these two people had offended Pharaoh somehow, and they were in guard. And anyways, in verse 5 it says, they each dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, and each man according to the interpretation of his dreams, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were bound in prison. And in the morning when Joseph came to him, you know the story. Joseph said, they said, what are your faces? We had dreams. Oh, I know about dreams, And, in verse 8 it says, do not interpretations belong to God? Now tell it to me. And, the amazing thing is they did. Here he is, a young Hebrew slave in this thing. And, of course, these guys are both sitting in there cooling their heels in this prison, and believe me, this was not luxurious digs. In the old days, there were mud brick walls probably. Hopefully, because these guys were high status, they had clean straw to lie on, not just dirty, ugly stuff, and maybe not too many rats for pets, this sort of thing. But anyways, Joseph interpreted the dreams correctly for them, and he told the cupbearer, that in 3 days he was going to, that Pharaoh would forgive him and he'd be back in his old job, and how the story goes. And the baker's saying, boy, that sounds like good, what's going to happen to me, and he said, well, after he heard his dream, 3 days, king's going to kill you and he's going to hang you up and the birds are going to eat your body, which is probably not what he really wanted to hear 3 days in advance, But that's, of course, what happened. And it was amazing, of course. The point was that Joseph made the point after he told the cupbearer his good news. Joseph asked him, he said, but remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this place. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. Yeah, he'd been sold by his own brothers into slavery, kidnapped. And here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Yeah, I was set up by this woman who falsely accused me. Okay, she was, but he was just a slave, and she was an Egyptian, the aristocracy. There's no question. He was in prison. That was just the way it was. But of course, it says the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph when he got his job back, and he forgot about him, and 2 years passed. Think about this. Here Joseph is partnering with God, and God had given this dream, and it was 17 when this had happened. Now he's now about 30. 13 years he's been a slave, first in a household and then in prison. This was a difficult thing. But again, the next thing you find out is, of course, Pharaoh had his dreams. And Joseph, again, all of a sudden the cupbearer comes to the point and says, oh, I remember somebody who's good about this. And I sort of forgot about him, didn't I? And he brings up the whole story. And Pharaoh brings him out of prison and gives him an opportunity. Here's what he has to say about his dream, that there's 7 years, good years of plenty, and then they're followed by the 7 years of famine. And it was going to kill a lot of people. In the ancient world, in the modern world, we don't really know much about famines that much. Because, when we go to the supermarkets, we expect there to be food there. But if things stopped running for about 3 or 4 days and the system stopped moving food from one part of the continent to the other part of the continent here in North America, what do you think your supermarket shelves would look like? If all of a sudden there wasn't any food in the supermarket, do you think we'd start to get pretty hungry pretty fast? Well, I think we would. And, even though that we haven't known famine, most of us in our lives, maybe some of us, if you come from different parts in Africa, maybe if you're an immigrant, you might know something about famine if you come from Eastern Africa in some places. But most of us don't know how desperate this is. And this was a large-scale famine that was over much of the Middle East. And it says here, and as you can see, let's go to Genesis 41. Let's go to Genesis 41, and we'll see in verse 53. And the 7 years of plenty that was in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. And according to Joseph had said, and the famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. Because Joseph had the foresight, he said, well, during the good years, let's put aside grain and save it, so we'll have it for the bad. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt, and all lands came into Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in the lands. Chapter 42 and verse 1. And when Jacob realized there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, why do you stare at one another? And he said, behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy for us from there, so that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's remaining 11 brothers, you know the story, went down to Egypt. And, of course, the whole thing was that they came eventually to Joseph because Joseph was administering the program of who got to buy and who didn't from that standpoint. And when he saw his brothers, of course, he recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. He was, this is but 13 years. He's dressed as an Egyptian, with the eye makeup and the whole works. Okay, they would have had an interpreter speaking, this back and forth, because that would have been the style, speaking Egyptian to Joseph and speaking Hebrew back to these people, and so they didn't really know him. But you know the whole story. Joseph understood, however, very clearly. We go through the whole story. Eventually, we see that Joseph saw that God had used him through all these circumstances to do something for him. If we go to Genesis chapter 45, we'll see where he says this. Genesis 45. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by. This is when he revealed himself to his brothers. He said, cause every man to go out from before me, and no man stood before him, while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard of it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? And his brothers could not answer him, for they were troubled at his appearance. That's probably that's not really going to the extent of it at that point in time. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves that you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be no plowing and no harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And now you did not send me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. And this was, Joseph understood. He had been and become a partner with God. He'd become a partner to preserve that heritage that God was working with, that I spoke of in previous weeks, talking about this heritage, the covenant community that he had started to establish with Abraham and Isaac and his father Jacob, who was renamed Israel. It was something that God engineered for those he picked and wanted to work with him, to partner with him in it being part of this story. And of course, it is now part of the story. Let's go to Exodus chapter 2. And what, of course, they did, as you know the story, Jacob and all of his family eventually moved to Israel. Moved from the land of Canaan to Egypt, where they lived for a long time. And of course, eventually what happened, of course, after Joseph died and that Pharaoh died and the dynasty changed and you got a new dynasty, and, they didn't remember Joseph and they didn't really like his family. They didn't like the Hebrews. They were different people. They were scared of them politically because they had other people in there. And you see very clearly from this standpoint that in the whole story in this first chapter of Exodus, that the Egyptians decided that they were really going to be hard on the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. But God wasn't going to forget them because God had a covenant with his people and he was working with them. If we go to Exodus 2 in verse 24, it said, and God heard their groanings. Yes. He heard the oppression that they were suffering under and that they were leading. God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. God acknowledged them. He didn't forget them. Sometimes God calls to partner with him, even those who don't come from among those who've benefited from having this heritage and the knowledge of being part of the commonwealth of the covenant people. That's the whole story of Ruth. You know, if you go to the book of Ruth, and let's just turn to the book of Ruth real quickly. Book of Ruth. We have the story of an Israelite family who, during another famine, hundreds of years after the time of Joseph, who because of the famine have to leave their land, and they went because they heard perhaps there was, from the standpoint that there was pasture land or something where they could graze their flocks or whatever it was that they were doing economically, that the grass was greener over in Moab than it was over in the land of Israel around Bethlehem where they were. And they left. They went there to live in the country of Moab, as it says here. And Ruth in chapter 1 and verse 2, and the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his two sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem and Judah. And they came to the fields of Moab and stayed there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her two sons, and they took wives for themselves from the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they lived about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion also died, both of them. And the woman was left without her sons and her husband. Eventually she decided to go home at this point in time because she heard that things had improved back in the land of her birth. And she had her two daughters-in-law, her sons' wives, widows, and she gave them a choice. Well, actually, she said to them in verse 8, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead." She said, "Go ahead. You know, it's over for me. It's all over for me. I mean, you know, my life is hard. My life is bitter." And one of them did. Orpah left, kissed her mother-in-law and left, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, that is, Naomi said, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return back with your sister-in-law." And Ruth said, "Do not beg me to leave you or return from following after you. For where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. And your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord God do so me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." I'm sure she felt she had this covenant of marriage. It made her part of Naomi's family, and she wasn't going to give up on it. And she made this confession of faith that your people will be my people and your God will be my God. You know, it's very amazing. You know, when you think about this, Ruth, did she attract at that point in time God's attention? Or was it before, when perhaps when her husband selected her, picked her out? But we know from the story, of course, that eventually she got married. There was somebody, when they went back, there was a man named Boaz, who was a good man, an upright man, one who could be a redeemer, who could actually buy the inheritance and be able to take care of the family of, the property that Naomi had, buy it from her, and also take Ruth as his wife. And he did. And she had a son. They called him Obed. Obed was the grandfather of David, who became king of Israel, who was, of course, one of the ancestors of Jesus Christ. So Ruth had an opportunity. God opened some doors, and it remarkably made it possible for her to become part of his covenant people. He made it, not only did she bear an heir, and that was part of her job, but she also trained him in the ways of God, because she was obviously a woman who very much had this unconditional love for God. God has a steadfast love. He has a steadfast love for his people. He has a steadfast love for all those who've entered into his covenant. If you go with me to Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 3. Isaiah 55 and verse 3. I'll read this in the English Standard Version. "Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live. And I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples. He was a witness. He's a witness to us still in this day. A leader and commander for the peoples. You shall call a nation that you did not know, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you because of the Lord your God and the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. This is in many ways prefiguring that God, of course, just as in the days of Noah when he was working with, as it were, the remnant of humanity, that God was looking forward to a time when he's going to be working with those who have that meek and quiet spirit, who have that purity, the innocence, the desire for what is righteous and true, and he was going to work with them to be part of his plan, to be part of his story. Let's go to Isaiah 49. Let's go to Isaiah 49 in verse 1. Read this in the New Living Translation. Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 1. Listen to me, all you in distant lands. Pay attention, you who are far away. The Lord called me before my birth, for within the womb he called me by name. He made my words of judgment as sharp as a sword. He has hidden me in the shadow of his hand. I am like a sharp arrow in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel. That's a man who wrestles, who strives with God or for God. And you will bring me glory. You will bring me glory. This is the purpose of God's calling. This is the purpose of those who live in covenant, in partnership with God. Verse 4, but I replied, but my work seems so useless, and I spent my strength for nothing, and to no purpose. Yet I'll leave it all in the Lord's hand. I will trust the Lord for my reward. In some ways, I know for many of us these days, when we think of the things that have happened in the Church of God over the last few decades, we can say, my work seems so useless. I spent my strength for nothing and to no purpose. And yet whatever we do in living in this covenant with God, we leave it in God's hand, in the Lord's hands, because it's his work after all, and it is his story, and we're just partnering with him. Verse 5, and now the Lord speaks, and the one who formed me in my mother's womb to be his servant, who commissioned me to bring Israel back to him. The Lord has honored me, and my God has given me strength. He says, you will do more than restore the people of Israel to me. I will make you a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. This was the purpose. This was the work to do that, of course, Jesus Christ was commissioned to do. And those of us who are taking part with Jesus are also entered into this same work. We're entered into this work to bring God's salvation to all the ends of the earth. Let's skip down to verse 8, and this is what the Lord said. At just the right time, I will respond to you. In a day of salvation, I will help you. I will protect you and give you to the people as my covenant with them. And through you, I will reestablish the land of Israel and assign to it its own people. This phrase is actually quite famous. We'll close with these scriptures here. Let's go to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians in verse 5, chapter 5. And we'll go to verse 18. All things are from God, who has reconciled us to him through Jesus Christ and has given to us the ministry of reconciliation, which is that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and he has entrusted to us this message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. See, this is our job. For those of us who want to partner with God, whom he's choosing to do this, as it were, is exhorting you through Christ. We beseech you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that he might become the righteousness of God in him. We then, working together with him, are also exhorting you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in an acceptable time I have heard you, and in a day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is an acceptable time. Behold, now is a day of salvation. This is a time when we're looking forward to. This is our time at this point in time. We have this opportunity to partner with God, to be part of the story. Go down here to verse 14. What does God say to us? He says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. No, Jesus said, take my yoke upon you, for it's light and it's easy. We're to be yoked with Christ, with Jesus. For what do righteousness and lawlessness have in common? And what fellowship does light have with darkness? No, it doesn't. And it can't be in covenant with God. And what union does Christ have with Belial? And what part does a believer have with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For you are the temple of the living God, exactly as God said, I will dwell in them. Will be circumcised in the inner heart, in the inner man. I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Because God has made a covenant with us. We've come into this everlasting covenant. Verse 17, therefore come out from the midst of them and be separate, says the Lord, and touch not the unclean, and I will receive you. Is it a contract that God is receiving us into? Verse 18, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. That is the covenant we're living in, the everlasting covenant, to be part of God's family. He calls us to have a work and a job, to be part of a story that he's begun with from the beginning.